Dobry utwa, kolegi. At the age of 77, I am making my very first visit to Russia, which is very exciting and rewarding for me. A big, big thank you to the organizers of this wonderful conference for inviting me. I'm afraid I'm one of those people that Dmitry Kravchov yesterday mentioned who have not learnt Russian yet, although I've tried a couple of times in the past. As the last plenary speaker, I not only want to congratulate our friends in IMO on this landmark conference, but I wish them all the very best for the future celebrations of their 70th anniversary, as I gather there are further landmark events to come. Well, my topic does not closely fit the themes of this conference, but there are 2 points of contact, I believe. The first is language teaching. If we can show how a language is changing, this may be of interest to teachers and should perhaps be ultimately reflected in teaching. The second point of contact is technology. The changes in grammar I'm going to talk about could not have been investigated without the use of computer corpora. Corpus linguistics began for myself in 1970, a long time ago, when at my own University of Lancaster we started to compile a British corpus to match the original Brown corpus that had been compiled at Brown University in the USA. Since then, corpus linguistics has extended its influence widely into all branches of linguistics, and the corpus is being used also in language teaching, as some of us were discussing yesterday. One of the extensions, for me, has been the compiling with colleagues of a whole family of computer corpora based on the same plan as the Brown corpus of 1961. These are comparable corpora sampled at roughly 30-year intervals. Let me see if this works. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Okay, there we are. Family of corpora, the Brown and the Lob corpus, which were the first ones in the middle there. And since then, various corpora have been created. These big circles of text give you the idea. We're still missing one here, but we're building up quite a historical pattern, tracking what has happened to the English language, in the written language at least, during the last 100 years or so. Now, if I move on, yes, each corpus then has a 1 million word in all, and has 500 text samples grouped into 4 text categories. Then we have the press, we have the academic section, we have the fiction section, and we have the general section, and they're matching completely. Now, many of the changes associated with this increase they are actually changes in frequency which we observe in the corpora, and they seem to have some social explanations, which I want to focus on today. Let's take one example: colloquialization, adapting written language towards spoken norms, moving from written towards spoken norms. And one of the examples is there. I won't spend much time on these because we're short of time, obviously. Americanization, following the American lead. We in Britain and all other English-speaking countries in the world, in some ways we are Americanizing our language, using American habits, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Grammaticalization. This is not so much a social thing, but it's a very important method or process of change which historical linguists have emphasized a great deal, the process of turning lexical material into grammatical material. And let's mention the last one here, densification, not a pretty word, but the idea is that we are packing more meaning into less space, particularly in the written language. For example, in press headlines, that's one example. And there are other influences, not quite so important perhaps. We have the influence of prescriptivism. We have language gurus, language pundits who tell us how we ought to use the English language, even if we do not. And one example is the advice to avoid the passive. This has had a big effect, for example, through word processing software all over the world. And democratization, ironing out differences between people's statuses. It's very unfashionable in the English-speaking world in particular, perhaps, to make discrimination between different people, male and female, one of race and another, older people, younger, all the things, we all become guys. We're not referred to anymore as Mr. X and Mrs. Y. We tend to be called by our first names, or we have a general term like guys, which applies to everybody, children, male and female, and also adults, and teachers, of course. Okay, so a word about colloquialization. One obvious example of this is shown in this chart here. Just to explain what this chart shows, we've got up here the number of occurrences per million words, which is obviously increasing on this chart, and we then have the different years of the corpora showing development up to 1991, and the different subcorpora, the different parts of this big corpus, and the overall trend. Obviously, we find that fiction writing is more close to the spoken language, and therefore that shows the biggest increase. But other varieties of the corpus also show increase. For example, in the press, we're making more use of these contractions, like don't instead of do not, it's instead of it is, and so on. Even in the written language, which used to be considered a bad practice. Or take the present progressive form, as in I'm liking it. Perhaps that famous McDonald's slogan, I'm liking it, would not have been used 50 years ago. It's a new trend. Growing use of the progressive form. Why do I consider this to be a case of colloquialization? Well, it's because the progressive is much more common in the spoken language than it is in the written language. And so if we study the written language and see the progressive increasing, we are saying it's really growing more similar in this respect to the spoken language. Now, here we have a decline of the passive. I mentioned the passive just now as one of those shibboleths that people complain about, the use of the passive. But actually, there is another reason for the decline of the passive. In this case, we've got the British line, the British corpora, and we have the American line. Unfortunately, we don't have the American result for the earlier period, but we see that the Americans are taking a lead here, as in many other respects, in the use of the passive. The Americans are avoiding the passive more strongly than the British are in this case, but we're both avoiding the passive. Now, why should that be considered a phenomenon of colloquialization? Well, the passive is very rare, comparatively rare, let's say, if not very rare, in conversational language. Where it is very frequent is, of course, in technical and particularly written styles of language, particularly academic writing and so on. And so therefore, when passive declines, again, it's moving more towards the spoken norm rather than towards the traditional written norm. Grammaticalization, let's take the example of be going to. In speech, be going to began to grammaticalize about 500 years ago. Now it has become almost like a future tense in English. Through colloquialization, this grammaticalization process is also affecting the written language. Similarly, have to has become almost a new modal auxiliary verb like must. So we're getting this new trend, new modal auxiliaries, new future tense developing primarily in the spoken language through grammaticalization, but then through colloquialization, this trend also moves into the written language. So we show an increasing use of these semi-modals. And this is a chart that shows that trend. On the one hand, at the bottom here we have the what we call the semi-modals, this new generation of modals. Not very new, maybe. They've been going for a couple of centuries or even several centuries, but they are getting more and more frequent all the time. Very slightly here, we find that these semi-modals have to, be going to, want to, need to, better, supposed to, etc. These are the ones which are increasing at the bottom. What's happening at the top is that the traditional modal auxiliaries a well-known class of verbs like will, would, can, could, may, might, shall, should, must. These are declining. And as the blue line shows, they are declining more in American English than in British English. Now, is that because of the growth of these nodals here? It doesn't seem to explain them all, but some part of this decline of these modals, let me just emphasize that they're not disappearing by any means. They're still very frequent in the language, but nevertheless, this is a declining trend, which has been going on for many years. And is that due in part, perhaps, because it is competing more with the semi-modals, particularly in the spoken language. Moving on. Yeah, so let's just take one quick look at some of the more common cases where the decline is set in. Must has declined enormously here, as you see, over the last 100 years. It's still doing so. The same applies to may here. Shall and ought to and need, all these, need as a modal, that is, all these are examples where there's a big decline. They are less frequent nowadays than they used to be. Perhaps we might even say that in teaching the language, we don't need to give any priority at all to words like shall and ought to. Now, must, again, showing the same trend with must. And once again, we see that American English is taking the lead, British English is following in the avoidance of must. And then we compare that with have to, which in a way is competing with must. And we see that have to has been increasing. We see this trend in British English and also in American English, and perhaps not so strikingly. And, of course, this is the opposite of must. So the suggestion is perhaps as must declines, have to is increasing. And there's a third semi-modal to consider to express the same notion as of obligation, and this is need to, and we see this is really increasing very sharply indeed. If you go back to have to, you might wonder, well, why is have to declining here? And part of that reason, perhaps the whole reason, is that need to is somehow taking over from have to in some respects. And it's interesting to consider why this should be happening. One possible thing is that have to, if you compare have to and must, it's often said that must is more authoritarian, face-threatening word to use. If you say you must do this, it's something that somebody feels very threatened by. But if you use have to, it's not so bad, because in that case the obligation, as it were, comes from external sources, not from the speaker. But need to is even more favored, if you like. If we consider this trend of democratization, I don't want to behave like an authority figure towards you, so I use need to. And this implies really that it's in your interest. It's the interest of the subject person to do this sort of thing. So we all may need to become more aware. This means that it's in our interest. It's good for us, not just for the world. So in that respect, needs to becomes more favored in recent usage than have to, and even it's not actually more frequent than have to, because the numbers are not so big, but it's as it were, competing more and more with have to and also with must. Densification, packing more things into less space, pour more meaning into less space. Here's an example, looking at the four types of text again. Especially, we find this in the press. Of course, the press has to compress its information a lot into small space. And it's part of this information overload that we face in our present societies. We're always facing more and more information that we have to process, and that we have to get out into the world our own information. We have to decode other people's information. So one possible reason then for this decline of the genitive, not something anybody would normally expect, to find this old-fashioned apostrophe S, one of the few inflectional endings in English remaining. Why should it suddenly be increasing? I believe that densification is part of the reason. So why densification? Oh, sorry, I'll just go back to that one example there. Television's effect on the nation's young. This is typical modern journalistic use, right? The use of apostrophe S here, rather than using the of construction, the effect of television on the young of the nation. If we turn to the S genitive and the of genitive, this helps to explain why. Look at the first three examples. The fruit of the coconut palm's fruit, the coconut palm fruit. These two possibilities, 1A and 1B, we get rid of the of, we use apostrophe S, or maybe we just put the nouns together, just juxtaposing the nouns together. And of course, 1A and 1B are more compact. They use fewer words, they take less syllables than number one. And this is the same, for example, like this one, the center of the city of Madrid, the Madrid city center. So if you then look at the use of the of preposition, of course, is the most common preposition in English, and is still the most common even after this decline. But what I'm pointing out is that there's an obvious and fairly strong decline in the use of the of phrases compared with the apostrophe S. Now, I made a terrible error. I just noticed it. The tail of the cat is getting more common than a cat's tail. No, sorry, I'm wrong. I should have said the tail of the cat is getting less common. This is the point. Yes, okay. Now, just looking at noun sequences. Sometimes we get bits of journalistic writing which are so packed with nouns that you can hardly make sense of them. All the underlined words here are nouns. The aviation, Rocinio, Kingpin, Kerkorian, finally sold MGM's film entertainment division to Pate boss Giancarlo Paredes. Oh yes, nouns. So this is the journalistic style and also the style in which many types of written English are moving. And we show now on this chart American English climbing up there and British English following on behind, like seems to be quite natural to us. We somehow follow the American example, and we're even catching up with the Americans. Of course, we wouldn't admit that we're following the Americans, but this happens nevertheless. So Americanization is part of the story right the way through there. Relative clauses, this is going on to a final topic, Americanization and prescription. Okay. American English in some ways is more susceptible to being guided by English language experts, or so-called experts, people who advise us on the way to use English. And one of those is illustrated by relative clauses here. The person to whom you were referring, the person you were referring to. Okay, that's fairly straightforward. I don't know how many of you would agree with me, but this one is more likely to decline. This is less common these days than the second one in some respects. Similarly with which is declining a lot, but that is increasing. Zero relativizer is also increasing. I'm really interested here in which and that, which have been subjects of quite a lot of high priests of usage, tele, and high priests of usage include people like Bill Gates, the man who builds Words for Windows software, who tells us when we start using which at a non-restrictive relative clause that we should not, sorry, a restrictive relative clause, and this should be avoided. We should use that rather than which. That is a rule that you won't find in any of the traditional grammars, but it's grown up as a kind of shibboleth nowadays, that everybody should avoid that, use that rather than which. And we see this in the chart here, declining use of which as a relative pronoun, the matter which you mentioned. And here we have American English has gone further in its decline than British English. And this is interesting. It shows that British English is imitating American English, as the chart shows. To begin with, we are not really seriously affected. We are still declining, but the big decline between 1961 and 1991 for American English is imitated in the line for British English. So we get this view which is rather like a diamond or a nutcracker, showing that British English is following the American trend, but at a slight decline. So I'll come to the end now, and thank you very much indeed.
very much.
I want to say
Leech.
one last thing. I've been talking about one language, English, but it would be very interesting to know whether similar trends are taking place in other languages. I have some indications that they are in some languages, so if you have any opinions or evidence of this kind, I would be interested to learn about them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.